Good day again, everyone, to everyone who's joining us today. My name is Asiphe Mkhalisa, and I will be facilitating today's session. Let me take this chance to first welcome you all in today's discussion or seminar rather. I thank you for joining us today as we meet under the theme of observing and changing the social life of plastics. Today's session is part of the heritage seminars offered this September by the Institute for Coastal and Marine Research, which is CMR in short. The seminar series focuses on the role of marine intangible cultural heritage in ocean development and sustainability. The discussions during this seminar series are to inform responses to global challenges and enhance the sustainable development of coastal zones through research, particularly research in the country nationally and also regionally. I'm excited about today's seminar and we look forward to your engagements as well. Colleagues, just before introducing the speaker, kindly note that the session is recorded for report purposes. Please keep your mics muted as well as your videos are muted to allow a more broader and smooth discussion throughout this session. You may post comments or questions as the program moves, and we will entertain all those engagements and questions once Prof is done. So today's session focuses on whether we have hazardous heritage by looking at plastics and sociality in Gqeberha, previously known as Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And joining us today is Prof. Rose Boswell. Prof. Rose Boswell is an anthropologist and poet. She earned a PhD in anthropology from the Free University of Amsterdam, Netherlands in 2003. Prof. Boswell is currently a Department of Science and Innovation, known as DSI, National Research Foundation, NRF, Tier 1 Research Chair of Ocean Cultures and Heritage at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Her work involves transdisciplinary research on coastal and island cultures, as well as heritage, including a focus on oceans conservation in the selected field site of coastal South Africa, Kenya, Namibia, and Mozambique. Prior to her appointment as a research chair, she served as Executive Dean of Arts at Nelson Mandela University from 2015 to 2019, and as a professor of anthropology at Rhodes University, also in South Africa, from 1997 to 2014. During her tenure at Rhodes University, she served as a research team leader for the Mauritius Truth and Justice Commission from 2010 to 2011, leading a team of 7 researchers to investigate the legacies of racism after slavery in Mauritius. Her research has been funded by the Netherlands Foundation for Tropical Research, known as NWO Worthro Condestria, which is the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in South Africa, as well as the Organization for Social Research, Social Science Research in East and Southern Africa, and the South African National Research Foundation. She is a recipient of the Belgian Government Development Cooperation Prize, which she received in 2000 for her work on civil society in Mauritius. She is recognized for excellent teaching in winning the Rhodes University Vice Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Medal in 2009 and received a prestigious fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation in New York for a scholarly residency at Bellagio in Italy in 2011. Colleagues, I am not done, but I'm going to be done very soon. She has done anthropological field research in South Africa from 1993 to 2020. Mauritius in 1999 to 2016, as well as in Zanzibar from 2004 to 2007, and Madagascar from 2009 to 2010. And lastly, in Seychelles from 2005. Her research work has explored gendered identities, embodiment, sensory human experience, the legacies of slavery, serialization, cultural heritage and race. She is an author of Le Malaysia Creole, Ethnic Identity in Mauritius, Oxford, as well as representing heritage in Zanzibar and Madagascar, which was published in Addis Ababa. She is also an author of Challenges to Identifying and Managing Intangible Cultural Heritage in Mauritius, Zanzibar, and Seychelles, as well as an author of Post-Colonial African Anthropologies, which is co-edited with F. Nyamjo from Pretoria. She has a forthcoming co-edited book with Jeremy Hills and David Ognaye in 2022, which will be published in 2022, entitled Blue Heritages, Global Perspectives on Oceans, Histories, and Cultures. Her two poetry books are published by RPCIG in Bamenda in New York, and they are entitled Things Left Unsaid, which were published in 2019, and Pandemics in 2020. Colleagues, we are blessed to have Prof. Boswell in this platform, as you have seen all the work that she has done in engagement research and writing, and all the accolades that she comes with. But before handing over to Prof, just to give a brief abstract on the work she will be discussing with us today. So although it has multiple beneficial uses, the overproduction and consumption of plastic has made the substance toxic for humans and the natural environment. The article that Prof will be discussing today focuses on plastics and sociality in Gqeberha, a city of the Eastern Cape province in South Africa. It analyzes plastic as a meaningful artifact and hazardous heritage for coastal South Africa, drawing attention to the intricacies of modifying human use and abuse of plastics, as well as the importance of context-specific approaches to addressing its increased use. A key argument presented in hegemonic gender and racial values continue to shape plastic use and abuse in South Africa. So the article also shows how tightly aligned plastic use is to specific notions of sociality and modernity, and proposes that domestic policy regarding coastal management and pollution do not but should consider microsocial and feminized aspects of pollution. Well, colleagues and friends, allow me to call Prof. Rose Boswell so we can hear more about this article. Over to you, Prof.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Asipe and Tara and colleagues from the CMR and beyond. It's really been a very busy month, given that it's Heritage Month, but I thought it would be a good idea to actually do a series of talks or presentations on issues of heritage affecting both the South African and the broader African context. So without further ado, let me just share my screen so that we can begin with the presentation. So the title is slightly amended. Sorry, something's going on here. Give me a second. Share the screen. Here we go. Always takes a little bit of time to get this going. Here we go. Right. So the title is slightly amended, speaking to hazardous heritage, describing plastics as hazardous heritage. and specifically the social life of plastics, which I think when we are considering the issue of plastics from the natural or the legal perspective, we often tend not to think about the fact that plastic actually has a social life in the context of societies that are rich with intangible cultural heritage. So the ethnography presented in the paper seeks to shift perspective on marine pollution by emphasizing the behavioral and gendered aspects or gendered practices that actually worsen or exacerbate plastic and ultimately marine pollution. As Asipe intimated in her reading of the abstract, it is proposed that plastic use is tightly aligned to specific notions of sociality, equality, and modernity, and that alleviation of the marine pollution crisis must therefore depend, or at least include, deep engagement in issues of social and bodily practices in South Africa, for in many ways, plastics form a part of the country's biocultural heritage. The presentation also covers a discussion on anthropology and advocacy for the students who are with us today, and the relevance of interdisciplinarity as an area of work for those who are embedded within the humanities. So to begin, and just staying with the slide for a moment, social scientists have long analyzed the relationship of humans to objects. In my earlier work on Madagascar, which Asipe highlighted in her presentation opening, and also teaching about the subject of island identities in the Southwest Indian Ocean, I learned that in the highland communities of Madagascar, an island off the east coast of Africa, objects actually became part of people's beliefs. In anthropology, we refer to these beliefs as animist beliefs, and animism is the practice of giving a living soul to plants, or any object which to us as outsiders may appear to be inanimate or not having any kind of living entity within it. But the people who are part of that culture and part of that society strongly believe that these objects are in fact alive, that they have a living soul. The Madagascar people, or the Malagasy people, as they are referred to in anthropological works, basically put together animal remains, inanimate objects of value, pieces of leather, cloth, and use these to protect themselves from evil or to achieve good luck. So they would be often found speaking to the object and saying things like, "You have eyes, but you do not see. You have ears, but you do not hear." In doing this, they give meaning and they give support and they recognize the fact that there is a living soul within this seemingly inanimate object. In other words, they give life to the object that for everyone else appears lifeless. The point I'm trying to make from the start is that human beings have, and they have developed, profound relationships with things that appear to be inanimate. It is not only in Madagascar, but the world over. One only needs to look at the attachment that people have to modern consumer goods to understand the depth of this relationship and the beliefs that it conveys. I would like you to keep this point in mind as we progress with the discussion. We do not need to look at exotic locations and seemingly unmodern communities to perceive such practices at play. So, as indicated then, the ethnography is going to shift perspectives on marine pollution. And I've already done this in the first step by suggesting to you that, in fact, even things which appear to be inanimate, in other words, not having a living soul, that in certain cultural settings, these things are given life. They are part of animist beliefs that percolate in the society and allow people to give meaning to objects. Up to now, many anthropologists in Southern Africa, and I dare say in Africa, have focused on identity as a largely social construct. And what I mean by this, that it is the social and political issues in our context that are perceived to have a larger impact on identity. Very few people, especially in our South African context, have examined or explored the role of material culture, or the relationship that human beings have to objects, and what these might do for identity and sociality. The United Nations Decade for Ocean Science, which is lasting from 2021 to 2030, is providing unique opportunities for discussion on this relationship, and especially the relationship between humans and oceans. There is particular concern about human or anthropogenic effects on the environment, and specifically the role of humans in proliferating or worsening the plastic pollution of our oceans and seas. Scholars analyzing global environmental degradation emphasize the importance of understanding the role of culture in conservation. And while natural science literature on marine plastic pollution remains valuable to an understanding of the chemical, the physical, and the biological impacts of this pollution, there is thriving literature on waste management and social analyses of plastic pollutions globally that can enrich and deepen our understanding of the scourge in the South African context. So this presentation then, and ultimately the paper that I'm currently sort of finalizing, hopes to add to this global literature and the global discussion, revealing the aspects of plastic pollution and plastic use in South Africa and the ways in which these social relationships are in fact worsening or exacerbating marine pollution. So focusing on Algoa Bay in the Eastern Cape province, I argue that a history of pernicious inequality and racialization of the society, along with new consumption patterns, are in fact amplifying the use of plastic at the coast. A key argument that I offer is that plastics are in fact socially constitutive. So it's not that humans are buying plastic goods and that they are using plastic goods to their own ends, but that plastics in a way have co-evolved with humans and that they now form an integral part of the society, leading to the social constitution of identities, especially of feminized women's identities in the context of our country. So in a society that remains highly unequal and racialized, plastics in the form of leisure and consumer items have a restorative function. They publicly reshape the identity of the population, marginalized under colonial rule and apartheid. But before we go deeper into this discussion, which I think is important if we are trying to frame the study or to understand the role that plastics actually play in the society and how it is situated within feminized and within class frames, we need to look at what the natural science data is actually showing us, because especially for the social scientists among us who perhaps have only really considered or thought about plastics in terms of its social use, it's important to understand the other side of the coin and to not dispense the natural science perspective. So what is the natural science data actually showing us? The science basically tells us that plastic debris also has an affinity for certain non-essential trace elements and what we call persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, such as PCBs. And some of you will remember, those of you who have lived in countries where you have malaria and yellow fever and other vector-borne diseases, you may recall that houses and canals and so on were sprayed with DDT. And so, yeah, so plastic debris has an affinity for things like that, for PCBs and DDT, so they stick to them. And once these plastics are charged or discharged into watery environments or aquatic environments, they can persist for up to 50 years, and their complete dissolution or mineralization may take hundreds of thousands of years. So it takes a very, very long time to get rid of it. In various species, it is noted that plastics has, an impact in terms of reproduction. It can cause reproductive impairment, neurotoxicity. So in other words, it can affect the neural networks, for example, of a particular animal or marine animal. The biotransformation of enzymes, it can cause gene or genotoxicity, long-term impairment of the DNA of a particular marine animal. It causes physical effects, behavioral effects, oxidative stress and damage. So it affects the formation and the discharge of what we call free radicals in the human body, causing things such as cancer, cytotoxicity, blood issues, etc., and the accumulation of other contaminants. And in essence, when we look at the effect on terrestrial animals, we find that these cattle, sheep, and other livestock who ingest plastic bags and other plastic items that are littered in the streets, and as a result of this, they may actually die from the obstruction caused to their digestive systems. Worse, humans also eat marine foods, so ultimately we are also affected. And our big issue, especially for humans, is that we are consuming what is known as microplastics, which are mostly polyester. They consist of polyester, and they're less than 2.5 millimeters wide. So they're really, really tiny. We can't always see them. It also comes off the polyester clothing, so your clothing will shed fibers and so on into the environment, into the air. You can inhale them, but it also comes to you in water. So even when we have recycled water, a percentage of that water or a part of that water will be containing microplastics. So it is really quite a challenge. Further natural science studies also show that plastics, and I see Dr. Lorian Pishagru is here with us this afternoon. The Sustainable Seas Trust is also very interested in plastic pollution, especially coastal pollution caused by plastics. We also find in these natural science studies conducted by SST and others that the seabed actually lacks oxygen. And so it's very cold, and there's very little of the sun's radioactive rays that basically penetrate down to the seabed. And what this means is that the plastics lay there and last even longer. And in fact, some of the more detailed studies actually show that these microplastics, these polyester, pieces, if you like, micro pieces that can be found between 4 centimeters to 2 centimeters beneath the top sand part, or in the seabed. It's buried actually in the seabed up to about 10 centimeters deep. And contributors to these scientific studies also show that the source of this plastic is from seagoing vessels, where the vessels basically dump their plastic debris into the water, disposable plastic cups, etc., and also land-based activities, which I'm going to be talking about in this paper. So just some figures, if there are any economists among us or those who might be interested in the figures, some quick stats. Who are the biggest producers of plastics and ultimately contributing to the microplastics problem? Asia produces about 50% of the plastics globally, followed by Europe, 19%. And in fact, if we look at the global situation, about 20% of the world's population produces more than 80% of its plastic waste, which constitutes about 275 million metric tons of plastic that are produced per year. It was really fascinating. We had a previous, when I first gave the first draft of this paper at the Brunel Research Festival, that was in May, these stats had been coming up, but it was very difficult to have a sense really of how significant this was. I mean, 275 million metric tons of plastic is huge. For those who are laypersons among us, and sometimes myself, when I think of tons and metric tons, I have to think, in very sort of layperson ways about it. Consider that the average SUV is just under 2 tons. And then you have to times that by nearly 100 million times. So Africa is importing plastic as well at an alarming rate. And a lot of the money that we are spending is going on plastic products, the bulk of which is being produced in Asia. So $285 billion worth over the period from 1990 to 2017. And South Africa was a major buyer in this regard. So since the fall of apartheid, and because of the rise in consumer products and the rise in consumption rates, South Africans have been buying about 12% of this 285 billion US dollars worth of plastic. So it's big business. Imports of plastics or polyethylene in 2015 was about 75 billion US dollars. And the annual plastic industry globally is about 600 billion US dollars. And South Africa, since the fall of apartheid, has imported about 195 billion US dollars worth of plastic. Now, the studies, the political economy studies basically show that many African countries have actually banned single plastic use. And in South Africa as well, where one finds increasingly now that one has to pay for single-use plastic. Some grocery stores have banned it altogether, but we still see that single plastic use is carrying on, and is apparent just from general observations. We can see it in our local communities. But the problem of other forms of plastic basically remain. And that's what I'm going to be touching on in the discussion. A 2020 IUCN study basically showed that in South Africa, only 16% of plastic is actually recycled. And the rest of it ends up at landfill locations where it ends up in rivers due to wind, littering, improper waste management, overflowing of landfills, and basically it can end up in the ocean. And according to Hankel and Burgess from the CSIR, about 8 million metric tons of discarded plastic basically end up in the ocean. And I think just to take the social science part into it, we can see that the problem is actually exacerbated by the fact that we have a growing middle class. So I suppose these are the wicked problems of modernity in a way, because if we look at South Africa, we need to consider and understand that for hundreds of years, people have been deprived. We need to understand the racialized discourse of South Africa, the patriarchal feminized discourse of South Africa, and how these things influence, identity and people's consumption patterns. And in fact, okay, let me just put this one here. This is also important because government basically focuses on what we call upstream factors. So the emphasis is on controlling, or at least attempting to manage, the importation of plastic goods into the country. But in fact, when we look around, just sort of general observation, especially in our city, we find that this is actually not ending, that there is this, African countries, including South Africa, are importing Chinese textile goods, clothing, and a vast range of consumer items. So my argument is that the problem of plastic consumption is also highly politicized and gendered. If we take what we call a feminist political ecology perspective, which is an interdisciplinary approach that brings attention to the environment, gender, and power. So it brings these three things together. And essentially what that does is to reveal how resource struggles and their consequences are in fact gendered. And secondly, how environment and gender are in fact co-constructed. I think that's very, very important. So I'd like you to hold on to this third point, which is that the environment and gender are co-constructed. And the point is that in South Africa, for example, and I think many people have written about this and talked about it, even my fellow chair colleague Pumla Kola has spoken about this in her work on patriarchy in South Africa. Gender experiences are intersectional. By this, I mean that gender identity is overlaid with racialized views of identity and class. Many of the women observed in the coastal setting presented in the study come from impoverished communities in our city. Their identities have been historically and negatively constructed in public discourse. They're often rendered invisible in media presentation of that which is considered beautiful and normal. And I argue that this experience forms part of the many what we call racial microaggressions that women of color actually face. So there's a continuous, one author speaks about the fact that if we look at the sexist, what he calls the sexist personal transformation discourse in the global north, and the use of that discourse and proliferation of that discourse in the global south, we find that it is fueled by popular and media it's fueled by popular and social media, which compels women to remain in an enduring process of self-transformation. So as women, we are in a way compelled to publicly and socially value the outer bodily shell that is aligned to or is coterminous with a Western heterosexual male ideal of femininity, which is promoted and destabilizes our sense of self, and as well as displacing our notions of intrinsic worth. And what happens is that to fill this void and to deal with the incompleteness, there is a compelling to actually consume meaningful goods and things to achieve this nirvana, or this heaven, if you like, of acceptance and normality. This particular author says that in undergoing the transformations and acquiring the props and goods to reach a better self, the better future is not in a distant time, but is experienced and felt in the present. So because of these historical delays, the impact of colonialism, the impact of apartheid, these discourses, racialized and patriarchal discourses, have actually shaped the way in which women perceive themselves, and in a way has locked women into this continuous process of self-transformation and self-representation in order to be deemed acceptable and normal and standard, and therefore not worthy of aspersions and marginalization. We also need to consider that even the spaces in which these identities are presented and articulated then become, part of that process. So leisure spaces, which, like the beach, for example, that perhaps could be seen as totally asocial and non-political spaces, acquired this political patina. And we know that under the apartheid system, because of segregation, very few people had access to some of the prime beaches in our city. And so what we're finding then is that people were, especially in the 1980s with the Take Back the Beaches campaign, there was this effort to reclaim the beaches, not just physically by being there as people of color, but to reclaim it in all sorts of ways. And we're seeing this again in the South African context. So I'm going to give you a little ethnographic extract from observations that had been done in Nelson Mandela Bay in December 2020 through to March 2021. No interviews were conducted for the data collection process because these are preliminary observations that form part of a larger study to understand cultural and social valuations of the coast and sea in Algo Bay. So for those who are part of CMR, it forms part of kind of like the preliminary observations, social observations of cultural valuations of the oceans, which is going to contribute to the Algo Bay Marine Spatial Plan, or MSP. So the aim of the present observations was to assess the ways in which visitors to the seafront use plastic goods and services that promoted the use of disposable plastic goods. And I used participant observation. And the study was done at the beach, but also beyond the beach. So I'm just shifting through the analysis, which is quite deep here. So let's go straight to the ethnography. So days before the end of the year holidays began in December 2020, the president of South Africa, many of you will remember this, announced that because of a resurgence in COVID-19 cases, the country would be reverted to an adjusted level 2 lockdown. Additional restrictions were instituted for the Eastern Cape province, where the city was situated. Not only would residents be required to adhere to the adjusted lockdown measures, they would not be permitted to congregate at the beach or in any public area until the middle of January 2021. The announcement was badly received by residents across the racial divide, since December is the peak season for holidaymakers, and most of the city's inhabitants take day trips to the city to swim or to have a picnic on the lawns adjacent to the sea. Moreover, most people are compelled to return to work at the end of the first week of January, and ordinarily the poorer inhabitants would make their way to the city's beaches on a few days of the year: Christmas Day, Boxing Day, New Year's Eve, and New Year's Day. So when the president lifted the beach ban, I observed social interaction on the beaches of the city and realized that the local inhabitants had turned January the 1st, which would have been, January 15 into New Year's Day. So ordinarily people would have flocked to the beaches on New Year's Day, but because of the ban, people could only come much later on in that month. So the coastal city, coastal town was filled with minibus taxis arriving from the satellite townships. Family alighted from the buses dressed in what appeared to be their New Year celebration clothes. They quickly marked off areas of the lawns adjacent to the beaches for family-specific gatherings. Some had brought food with them, but the majority had not done so. And a few hours later, it transpired that many had bought food from a nearby fast food outlet and other fast food businesses in the area. And these items arrived in cardboard and plastic packaging, complete with plastic utensils and cups. The beach ban had also coincided with an alcohol ban, meaning that inhabitants of the province were not permitted to buy alcohol except from licensed outlets. Even so, those who arrived at the beach came with alcohol and proceeded to consume and discard those into the public space. So that was glass rather than plastic. The fast food packaging that people had bought with them and the purchasing of fast food was not merely for convenience. It's also a marker of affluence or wealth, since one must be able to afford food that is made by someone else. For mothers and other women, fast food also represents gender liberation, since it ensures that women do not have to cook raw food, pack the cooked food, bring it to the public area. People arriving at the beach were not there just to enjoy themselves, they were also there to demonstrate their relative affluence through the consumption of alcohol, fast food, and the taking of photographs or selfies in a public area previously prohibited under the apartheid laws to those of color. Plastic was also apparent in the shoes that people wore. Sandals, trainers, waterproof beach shoes were part of the visitors' apparel. Plastic was in the wig and hair pieces worn by the women and girls. The South African apartheid system denigrated the African appearance of women to the extent that women with naturally styled hair were compelled and in fact encouraged to go and change this. To counter this, many women, especially since the early 1990s, have chosen to wear hair extensions. The extensions come from, are made mainly in China or India, and only the most expensive extensions are of natural, real human hair. So most hair extensions are of plastic or polyester and come with a warning that these are highly flammable. Plastic is also evident in cell phone casings, hair accessories, sunglasses, earrings, and other jewelry. And basically, from what I observed, multiple use plastics were everywhere. Not immediately observable, but probably present, was plastic in the fabric worn by visitors, since wool and other natural fabrics are extremely expensive in South Africa. It is likely that visitors to the beach on that day would have been wearing fabric that contains a high percentage of plastic, which would shed microfibers into the atmosphere and ultimately into the Earth's water sources. Of course, it's part of the leisure process to be at the beach. Children played with plastic spades and buckets. Older adults reclined under the shade of plastic-infused fabric beach umbrellas. Young boys used plastic bodyboards to surf the smaller waves, and further out still were the white, wealthier inhabitants of the area in rubber surf suits or doing stand-up paddling or kayaking, all in plastic seagoing vessels. Observation of the visitors to the beach on that day showed the extent to which plastics form a part of human leisure and the extent to which the making of classed and leisured identities depended on the use of plastics. Plastics ensured what I call a leisured materiality, the association of leisure and materiality, the use of specific objects constituting particular kinds of experiences and situated identity, shifting the narrative of these identities from one of lack, the mundane and the everyday, to the extraordinary, the photograph-worthy, the leisured space. As one would expect, the combination of sea, sand, fresh lawns, and the accoutrements of convenience, the hair weave, the fast food, the cell phone to capture memories, appeared to make visitors happy. Gone was the struggle to manage virgin hair. gone the struggle to buy, make, and cart food to the beach, gone the laborious process of having to remember what happened in the day because you have selfies, as well as attempts to convey such information at a later stage for others to recall and to associate one with this aspiring middle-class identity. While South Africans of color visited the beaches in high numbers after the beach ban was lifted into early 2021, white South Africans in the nearby suburb avoided the beach. Online, some made references to how the beaches were under apartheid, complaining that the beaches were cleaner then compared to now. It is striking to see, as I walked along the beach as a Black woman myself, that there were very few white people to be found in the beaches in those early days of the year. I would have to travel further up to the coast to places not easily accessible by public transport to observe white people at the coast. So what did I observe then away from those beaches? Away from the beach, there were white women buying food at upmarket grocery stores. These stores tend to emphasize that they are green, committed to sustainable agriculture and to minimizing waste management. On closer inspection, however, I found that many of the products sold, including vegetables, fruits, and greens, are covered in single-use plastic. In this context, it was evident that plastic use and abuse overlapped with notions of cleanliness, hygiene, and neatness. By buying food at these stores, a particular class of white women, aspiring to or part of the middle class, sought to publicly associate with the good business journey of the store and its commitment to environmental sustainability. Shopping at the store, however, was not just for this reason, but also to dissociate from those deemed to be of the lower classes and places focused on the mass market. So what we're seeing is that consumption of plastic, I don't have this in the paper, but I must put it in, the consumption of plastic is also allowing the continued differentiation of South Africans based on class. So plastic is facilitating class segregation. Ironically, at the store that I was doing observations, many goods in the mass market stores, many goods are not encased in plastics and therefore do a better job at contributing to environmental sustainability. Because the products at the high-end store are enrobed in single-use plastic, once these products are taken from them, the plastic is disposed of. In this suburb next to the sea, there were no areas set aside for recycling of goods. The plastic goods would have to be dealt with by the local municipality. The ethnography continues. I also came across women in hair salons and nail bars, and for women across the racial divide, the use of hair extension happens. But there are greater consumers. What I observed was that white women are greater consumers of particular chemical hair products, such as dyes, bleaches, and formaldehyde treatments. Moreover, and as I observed, they also consume what are known as nail acrylics. So on a Friday afternoon, I sat next to a woman who was having her nails done. The nails are soaked off with acetone, dispensing with old nails and applying new ones. The nails are also coated in new nail varnish that contain polymers. So theoretically, what does all of this show us? It shows that scholars of materiality offer that humans have situated experiences of material life. Such experiences lead to the creation of an object-rich world, which in turn further constitutes human experience. And what we see is that plastics appear to have become an integral part of human sociality and cultural life at the coast, especially feminized cultural life. They constitute the coast as a leisure space. It augments the coast as a place where self-worth can be elevated. And it constitutes the coast as a place where sensory flourishing and play is possible. This is really important for those who are perhaps, have been denied access to the beaches and so on, for a very long time, and only in recent years have gained access to, South Africa's wide range of public blue flag beaches. Embodiment scholarship is also another area of theory that is explored in the paper. It encourages us to see the co-evolution of human bodies, the incompleteness of being human. So if we look at the natural science literature, there's a lot of emphasis on toxicity, genotoxicity, neurotoxicity of plastics, the idea of the human as this, incorruptible whole that, whose the genetics of which have been established more than 100,000 years, more than 2 million years back. and that, you know, that evolutionary process is very slow. But in fact, what we're seeing, if we bring together the social and natural sciences, we see the incompleteness of the human and the co-evolution of human bodies with objects. And I think this challenges the idea or the perception of the body as something that is entirely corruptible by noxious substances. And in fact, there was, for the anthropologists who may be here today, there was a very seminal and fascinating study that was done by Mary Douglas way back in 1966. And she talked about pollution as being matter out of place. It's the reason why we sweep up and we clean and so on, is we want to get the dirt and the rubbish back in the bin. It's not so much that the house is dirty, it's really our perception of dirt as being matter out of place. But when we look at plastics today, we can see that plastic pollution, marine plastic pollution, is no longer matter out of place for humans because it's actually in human bodies. In fact, I read something that was a little bit disturbing, and I must wrap up now. I read something that was a little bit disturbing, which was that most of us are consuming the equivalent of a credit card's worth of microplastics per month. So if you have like 5 credit cards, just remember that after 12 months, you will have swallowed another 12. Francis Nyamjo and Divine's food studies here on Africa is really fascinating and valuable as well. It actually spurred me to start thinking about plastics as a part of human sociality. And he says, it's this business of wanting to continually constitute the self in public. And now that we have you know, such a visually oriented world with social media, the business of self-representation, especially for women, young women, is becoming even more, you know, prominent. There won't be time to go into the legal loopholes, but I'm going to gloss over them. There are three laws that are quickly looked at in the context of this paper: the Integrated Coastal Management Act, the Waste Management Act, and the Marine Pollution Act. And to cut a very long story short, none of these actually look at personal responsibility. So the Waste Act 59 of 2008 mentions littering as an offense, but does not note use and eventual legal disposal of plastic as part of waste management. So if we think about what is happening in municipalities and the fact that municipalities are not managing the proper recycling and disposal of plastic, a lot of that is ending up in our oceans. If we look at the ICM Act, it appears to only refer to the inclusion of those previously marginalized in coastal management efforts and plans. In other words, it talks about the rights of coastal communities in great detail, but it doesn't talk about, I think it could talk a little bit more about the obligations and responsibilities of individuals in that context. Similarly, if we look at South Africa's Marine Pollution Act, which was amended in 2019, the new one I think will come out soon, it only really refers to marine and coastal pollution as caused by ships. So a question that I'm left with as I'm trying to finalize this paper, and it might be the subject of another paper somewhere else, are South Africa's environmental laws more focused on the rights of citizens? What about individual responsibilities? So that's the end of the paper. You know, I think if I haven't even touched on, you know, what is happening elsewhere in the world. There was a fascinating study done on Brazil in a book called Gender Trouble. No, sorry, in a book on young women in Brazil by Edmonds, who states that, you know, these women were becoming what are known as silly, you know, the word silicon. So you describe these women as siliconadas. Siliconadas basically refers to women that have plastics in them. So these are women who are undertaking plastic surgery, and they are putting silicone in their breasts and various body parts in order to achieve a particular feminized ideal that is valuable to the hegemonic patriarchal society in which we live. So yeah, so this is the paper and this is the presentation, and thanks Asipe and colleagues. I look forward to some comments and questions before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for sharing that important research with us. It was indeed an informative presentation. Thank you for allowing this space to think critically about plastic and gender, as well as the environment in essence. I was particularly moved by the argument that you offered on plastic being socially constitutive in societies, especially societies that remains highly unequal and racialized as well. Also, your contributions on gender and plastic management. While speaking about plastic production, I began to think about the plastic consumption gender figures, as you were stating, especially particularly when it comes to the beauty aspects of it, when it comes to the food that we consume. And the studies that you've shared in terms of goods purchased by men, goods purchased by women, as well as gender non-binary persons, which contributes to the percentages of plastic use. Our colleagues, I'm looking at the chats right now, and I see there's a question. Perhaps also just to note that you can raise your hand and we will allow you the platform to ask your question or comment verbally. So there is a comment by Janine Adams saying, so it would be important to change the association and use of plastics in terms of leisure or affluence. Much can be done with social media and advertising. It may be more difficult to disassociate from cleanliness, particularly in light of COVID and germ spreading. I'm just going to look again for other questions. There's a comment by Balisa as well, saying, what an interesting presentation. Thank you, Prof. Perhaps Prof can just respond to such comments and questions, and then we'll see if we have hands or more questions from the chats. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks so much, Asipe. I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I think changing perception, of leisure is very important, because at the moment we have a perception of leisure that is based on consumerism or consumption, that you must travel, vast distances. I mean, Janine, your work on the carbon footprint, that you must travel far, in order to have this exotic and meaningful experience. And in fact, it was quite fascinating. There was I was reading for another document just the other day, and this particular author was saying that often leisure is basically, we are trying to provide ourselves with something that has been denied to us the humanity that has been denied to us on a daily basis. So, and that, I think that hypothesis, as they say, would actually hold, because if we look at, how the unequalness of South African society and the often unbelievably difficult circumstances in which people have to work, when it comes to leisure, there is this feeling, and in fact, the December period, and I didn't articulate this in the ethnographic discussion, but in social media, they were calling December with a Z, meaning that it is a feeling and a time that you start feeling that feeling of wanting to go on holiday and breaking free from the monotony of capitalist oppression around, sort of the early part of December, as opposed to like the 13th or the 14th or 15th of December, when most people get the opportunity to take a break. So we need to change perceptions of leisure, but I think a more urgent work needs to be done around the normalizing the presentation of women as they are, as opposed to, having this augmented presentation of self in order to feel and appear normal in the society, because essentially women are major consumers, and it is this, it's the media campaign for presentation of self that is often driving this consumption for these plastic goods. And if you consider even the cleanliness story or the hygiene story, we are told, for example, that we must use if you have young children and you send them off to school with a lunchbox, that it's best that you choose one that is BPA free. Of course, what they don't tell you is that you're still having a plastic, you know, that you're giving your child, putting the sandwich in a plastic as opposed to a paper bag, for them to continue. And ultimately that thing is going to degrade and you'll throw it away. And it's going to take a long time for it to mineralize. So yes, we need to change leisure. We need to change perceptions of leisure. We need to look at carbon footprint and leisure. These are some of the studies that have, I don't think if I don't know whether they have been done or not. And I would love to know, and I suppose with some SST colleagues here, I'd love to know what are the gender stats or the gender figures for the consumption of plastics, for example, in a city like ours.
Thanks, Rose. Interesting as always.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that response. Our colleagues, remember that you can raise your hand in order for you to ask your question or comment. But while we're waiting for more comments and questions to come in, I was just thinking, Prof, about one of the things that you've highlighted in your presentation, which is the management of waste. And I was puzzled by the thinking around the contribution by the lower income or lower middle income countries in terms of their disposal rates compared to high income countries. I know you've touched a bit on this, perhaps more light to it. And also, while looking at plastic use and the environment, your contribution on environmental behavior and gender, which are coexisting or rather intersectional in nature, has made me think about the still existing gender roles that differ from culture to culture, which are or may still drive the waste management control. So was there such a rating or finding in your research? So I just had those two questions on my end, and I see that we don't have hands as yet. So perhaps maybe you can comment on that. And if we don't have any other questions, we'll then move to closing remarks and closing the session for today.
Thanks so much, Asipe. Those are very nice questions. I was thinking that in terms of the management of waste, the difference, why is there a difference between supposedly high income countries and lower income countries? Well, it's not quite even in that regard. The main argument that I can offer there is that the consumption rates are higher. Consumption rates of plastic goods is higher in higher income countries simply because they have more disposable income to use for these consumer items. So cell phones, for example, shoes and clothing, the fashion industry, which is very much a seasonal story in the global north because of the sharp demarcation of seasons, that also fuels the consumption of goods, especially among women. But interestingly enough, if we look at the African states, some African states, especially Tanzania and Kenya and so on, those countries have banned single plastic use outright. And in fact, there's a fine if you actually import it. And so just in terms of that aspect, these countries are quite concerned to protect the ecotourism or the environmental tourism potential of their country. So they don't want these plastics in their country because that actually also influences the aesthetic or the look of their beaches and their communities and so on. One often finds also that consumption of plastics is classed in the sense that people are using and buying plastics for very different reasons. So for instance, single-use plastics is very important. This is something that I have yet to think about more carefully. But if we, from general observation, single-use plastic is useful for the carrying of goods. And if you don't have your own personal vehicle, if you're reliant on public transport you then need to have access to something or the other to carry your plastic goods with you. Whereas, you know, you're more likely to first of all, to afford a fabric bag or to put your stuff in a paper bag if you actually have a personal vehicle. But this is a theory that I think still needs a bit of testing. It's just a, you know, a thought that I'm putting out there. In South Africa, we don't have, I think I mentioned this in the presentation, but South Africa, you don't have the, you know, single-use plastic is, you have to pay for it now. And more people are beginning to use paper, which is good, but we still see the proliferation of plastics in the environment. I think a bigger question to ask, and I think maybe Lorian at some point we had a discussion about this with her team, was that it's not so much you know, the purchasing and the legal use of it. It's the fact that people are disposing of the plastic in a way that is detrimental to the environment. So we need to find ways of limiting plastic purchasing, but also you know, its legal, hopefully legal disposal. In terms of your second question about gender norms and differences, it's also very, very interesting that where in many sort of Southern African and especially East African societies, you find that people are using natural products, baskets, woven baskets, and similar kinds of goods to basically transport their materials about. So instead of actually using plastics, and instead of having gendered norms that are associated with a more westernized context, these individuals are sticking to indigenous practices, and many of these don't actually require them to have access to plastics or to using plastic. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. I see there's a hand by Dr. Gebi Dlamini. I'll just hand over to Doc to ask, or rather share the comment that she has. And after that, I'll hand over back to you, Prof, to respond and also offer some closing remarks before we move to the vote of thanks. Over to you, Doc.
Okay, thanks, Asipe. Thank you very much, Prof. Boswell, for a very interesting talk. I think mine is more of a comment than anything else. I was quite interested, actually. Well, one of the first things that came to mind, actually, as you were going through the talk, was when initially you started off talking about how we give sort of characteristics, humanistic characteristics, and also personalities to objects that don't have any of these things. And I was thinking about it particularly in the ways in which I suppose not only just humanistic characteristics, but sometimes even different kinds of value that we value different, for example, different kinds of plastics in relation to each other. And I was thinking about it in thinking back to, for example, the takeaway containers. What are they called again? Tupperware. The Tupperware containers at home versus the ice cream containers at home, right? And how for a long time when we went away on holiday, we would pack a lot of things. Depending on the kinds of food that we were packing, we would either go into the Tupperware container, and some foods would go, or if you have guests over, they get the ice cream container because you know that you can't, it might not come back. So the different kinds of values that we place onto different kinds of plastics. And I was thinking about that also in the kinds of ways in which you built up the different kinds of plastics that you see at beaches. And I was thinking about, for example, you talked about the weaves, and as a type of plastic, flammable material, to the kinds of plastics that are then like thrown away, the water bottles and those kinds of things, and about how different we see different kinds of values that are being sort of used and consumed, maintained, and also discarded in one. So it's not necessarily even like an issue of like, oh, we just throw away plastic, but it's about how we place value in particular kinds of plastics, in the same way of how we place value in particular kinds of plastic bags even. how different plastic bags have got different value because some plastic bags are reusable, others are not reusable, some are name brand plastic bags. So you keep them for various things. So the conversations around sort of like environmental and waste management, as well as how we communicate, how do we maintain the environment, how do people recycle, reuse, and all of those things are really conversations that need to be had, considering the different kinds of values we are placing to these kinds, to these different plastics, and also the kinds of plastics and where these plastics come from specifically. So it was more of a comment, but I just, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Doc, Gabby. That was really very, very useful. Indeed, I think I was kind of getting towards that argument, but I didn't quite, put it as eloquently as you did, which is that, we need to also look at, to even go into even more micro-social detail of plastic use, to look at the values that are actually accorded to different forms of plastics and why. Yeah, I mean, some are treasured. I mean, if you have a plastic bag that comes from a designer store, for instance, you're more likely to fold that plastic and keep it, perceiving it to be something that if you use it again even for a mundane kind of activity, people will then associate you with that kind of brand and that level of consumerism. So it's really is a society that I think where, the appearances are becoming even more and more significant now, especially online, in the online context, because of COVID-19. So people are no longer appearing as they are in front of one another, but through a simulated and brushed up, representation of the self, which is taking place largely in the online space. But on those particular days, I think we also do see that, because here is the opportunity to actually get away from the way in which people see you on an everyday basis, as a person who's working, a 9-to-5 job, but now you are a sort of a leisured person who is potentially an aspiring middle-class person. And all of that confers value onto the individual, not just through the objects, but onto the individual themselves in that point, for that particular point in time. And I mean, the same thing could be said of the women who are buying products from the stores that are covered in single-use plastics, because they are, in a way, simulating these notions of perfection and hygiene and so on through the foods that are being provided by the high-end grocery stores. Yeah, it's an interesting, I mean, it's layers and circles of representation.
Wow, thank you so much, Prof. I see there's an additional comment. I'll just read it for purposes of time, and then give over to you, Prof, to respond just quickly, and then we move to closing the session as we are behind with time. So this is the comment from Terence Smith, saying single use in general, even with paper bags or other biodegradables, should be discouraged so that we can save on the environmental costs of production. How do you think we can shift society from the convenience lifestyle of single use to reusing what we have instead? And colleagues, that would be our last question for today. Prof.
Thanks so much, Taryn, for that question. It's really fascinating. I mean, the paper was going to become really long if I continued, but I think one of the interesting things that is emerging now is an entire discourse of returns, pre-loved, second use, which is being associated with a greener approach to consumer goods. So reusing, items that you have, rehoming products that perhaps you no longer have an affinity for, but are still in reasonable use. And it's quite interesting to see how this idea, or this discourse rather, is taking off in a generationally defined group. So we find that this idea of recycling, of rehoming and reusing and so on is quite popular among the people known as millennials. But for those who grew up in the post-war years, the boomers, as they say, and Gen X's and Gen Z's, in the still highly neoliberal capitalist environment, the emphasis is still on consumption of goods, you know, changing your phone every year, every 2 years, that sort of thing, instead of looking at ways in which it can be recycled. So my concluding comment would be that, you know, I think a lot of this, we talk about these issues almost as if, you know, we have a lot of time to change them, change behaviors. But in fact, I think we've pretty much run out of time, figuratively and literally, because if we look at the COP26, you know, the report that was not quite released, but was made public the other day, whatever its faults, I think it's important to consider that, you know, the world is facing, you know, a climate crisis and environmental crisis, and that, you know, regardless of our supposed racial orientation according to apartheid or our class aspirations, it's important to start modifying these behaviors and to ask ourselves, to what extent are we representing ourselves for a system that doesn't serve us personally as women, number one, and number two, a system that actually doesn't serve the environment. So we need to start thinking about these things. And of course, women are important role models. Many studies done in West Africa to show that it's women that really shape the way the children and other family members respond to plastic use and recycling and so on. And so, I mean, and the fact that women are in many places now more educated than ever, it's really important that we look at these practices and ask ourselves whether we need to create the demand for the supply of goods that is coming to us. Yeah, thank you.
Well, colleagues, we've come to the end of today's session. We live today with an understanding that men, women, gender, and non-binary persons should act as agents of change in order to reduce plastic use related to basic consumption and to increase the recycling rates of plastic. Let us continue to raise awareness of the environmental problems such as plastic use, which leads to pollution. Thank you, Prof, again, for sharing your research, which vastly contributes to the Global Development Goals, and to the audience that joined us today. Thank you so much, ngeSxhosa sithi nangamso, meaning do kindly join us again next week, as Prof will be looking at salted identity, coastal personhood, and the rehumanizing of ocean conservation. I have shared the link on the chats and also more login details. The poster is up on the university's communication, and also it will be sent to each and everyone that is present here today. From my side, Asiphe Mkhalisa, I would like to say thank you for ensuring that this session runs smoothly and for your engagements. Colleagues and friends, goodbye. Have a great day further.